Hey, ladies and gentlemen, back again for part 2 of this story about the shooting of John O'Brien. So today, really properly, the trial of Isaac Jackson. So last week we talked about how a disagreement in front of Gitchell's store metamorphosed into an argument and maybe a fight, depending upon who you listen to, and the whole thing kind of ends up with John O'Brien being shot. We talked about how different parties felt that one side was the aggressor, or maybe the other. And like I say, we concluded with the notion that Isaac Jackson was indicted for the wrongful death of John O'Brien. So today we're going to talk about the trial of Isaac Jackson, which took place on the 12th of December, 1888. So before we start, I just want to, again, kind of put it out there that I'm not an expert on this case. I haven't researched it thoroughly. I've just gone through the newspapers at the time and kind of drawn out from that. So, like I say, I'm not an expert in 19th century law or law at any time, really. So, like I say, if I get some facts wrong, if I proceed on some bad assumptions, I definitely be grateful for you to let me know below, obviously in a kind and constructive manner if possible. So, like I say, I definitely appreciate that. I'm just an interested historian and found this story and thought to share it, strictly, as I say, for narrative purposes. So, with that out of the way, we'll begin. So it took a while. It took a couple of days actually to choose a 12-person jury, a 12-man jury, as it was at this time, to hear this case. Now, they went through the entire jury pool and had to go back through it in order to find 12 men. So, this may have been because the testimonies of the coroner's inquest had been published not long after they had been given. So, that may have meant that the defense felt that Isaac Jackson really couldn't get a fair shake if, there were a lot of people who had read this already and kind of had certain versions of the event already in their minds before anything started. Now, to get to the two lawyers on this, which I think were really interesting, it's interesting to kind of see who is there. We'll move to the magic window. Now, this time, actually, the folks in the magic window, unlike last week, they're actually the people that I am talking about. So it's not as if I'm just kind of drawing in representatives like I did last week. These are actually the folks I'm talking about. So we start with the prosecution, the defense trying to butt in there really quickly. The prosecution is headed by the Attorney General of New Brunswick, Andrew Blair. So the Attorney General of New Brunswick at this time is also the Premier of New Brunswick. So Andrew Blair is the Premier and the Attorney General. He's holding both portfolios simultaneously. It's interesting that the Premier is the prosecutor in this case. Now, another Premier, not yet, but a Premier that will be in the future, is the defense attorney, Lemuel Tweedy, from right here in Miramichi. So, Lemuel Tweedy is acting in defense. Later, he's going to serve in the government of Andrew Blair. So the two men, if they were strangers now, they certainly weren't going to be strangers in future. Now, Mr. Tweedy scores a number of points, I think, in the course of the trial. So we'll discuss that as we go. So the prosecution opens. So the prosecution opens with their first witness, Patrick O'Brien. Now, Patrick O'Brien more or less reiterates his testimony as we saw it months before. He does add a few things that I think were probably drawn from Matthew Carroll's testimony or definitely seem very similar to it. Talks about meeting Carroll, talks about kind of the joke that John O'Brien and kind of made toward Isaac Jackson, you are my prisoner, I arrest you in the Queen's name, all of that. That's all there, which wasn't there previously, but is there now. But the really important part of this, and I think really the important part of pretty much all the prosecution witnesses, with the exception of one, which we'll get to, is the cross-examination. Because, of course, their testimonies at this point have just been given, and they haven't really been questioned in any real way. So Mr. Tweedy, his first question to Patrick O'Brien is basically along the lines of, if you were heading home, You were wanting to get back to Rogersville. You had to go through Nelson to get there. You were leaving Chatham. How come it took you several hours to get from Chatham to Nelson? Now, initially, Patrick O'Brien basically lays it out that the reason why it took them so long was because he had to make this kind of unnecessary stop with Birchall's, because he was at Birchall's for a while before he got a chance to meet George Birchall Jr. He was talking to other people, he was in the store, all of this. But through a series of questions, Mr. Tweedy brings out that that was not the only stop that they made on the trip. And as a matter of fact, they were stopping in a number of places all along the way. And they were drinking at all these places. Now, Patrick O'Brien says that he lists them all off, and I've got some notes here, so I might refer to them in the course of this whole little piece, so bear with me. But he says they stopped at Kelly's, they stopped at Butler's, and they stopped at Pines, at least. And may have stopped at other places. He testifies that he definitely did not have more than 6 drinks. So definitely less than 6. Now, I think Tweedy is kind of bringing it out that, okay, I mean, you were consuming a fair bit of alcohol all along the way here. He asks, did you have a grudge against Isaac Jackson? And Patrick O'Brien more or less obliges him and said, yeah, I did, And he asked, did you say you were going to beat this guy up? Well, Patrick O'Brien sort of equivocates on that. He said he might have said that, but he doesn't remember saying that. He just said that he did say, that he was angry enough to do it, but he did not. He kind of stopped short of saying that, yeah, I said I would. But definitely says that, there was times when I was angry enough that I said, I was so angry that I could, but did not necessarily say that he would. That's a small factor, I'm sure. Henry Gitchell testifies next. Again, more or less lays out everything as it was. But again, in the cross-examination, kind of upends his own testimony in a way. Tweedy asks him if O'Brien had something in his hand. Now, clearly he's referring to a weapon of some kind. Gitchell basically says that he didn't see it, but he won't swear that there wasn't one. So, I think more importantly, he goes on to say in subsequent testimony under cross-examination that he won't swear to how does he put it? He won't swear to the distinct recollection of everything that he's testified to. So to me, again, I don't know. Maybe that's something that you can do, but I feel like to me that pokes a huge hole in his testimony entirely. By basically saying, I can't swear to the distinct recollection of everything that I saw. That definitely leaves the door open to calling his entire testimony into question. Because if he can't distinctly remember everything, does he? I think Tweedy's kind of opening a door to saying, well, what do you remember? Maybe not, and maybe that's an overstatement on my part. But it's definitely how I read it. So take that as you will. So, the subsequent witnesses, Elizabeth Gitchell, Matthew Carroll, again kind of lay out their points. Matthew Carroll, interestingly, he's asked by the Attorney General about the sobriety of everybody present. So he's again kind of reiterating his testimony from before, where the O'Briens show up, he and Gitchell are there, Jackson is with them. The situation kind of goes from there. So the Attorney General asks him, was everybody there? Were they sober? And Matthew Carroll basically says, well, I was. I can't testify to anybody else, but I was definitely sober. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Tweedy asks Carroll over the objection of the Attorney General, which is overruled, what he knows about John O'Brien's demeanor. What does he know about his reputation? So it's interesting because Matthew Carroll basically says, I heard he was kind of a quarrelsome guy. So I think that's really, again, that's kind of important testimony, not something that came out before, not something that came out in his earlier testimony. Tweedy basically gets Matthew Carroll to say, yeah, I heard he was kind of a, by reputation, he was a quarrelsome individual. So I think that's really kind of important. Susan Carroll and Dr. Francis Desmond also testify, again, kind of reiterating things that we had known from the earlier statements. Desmond specifically is testifying just in order to reiterate the cause of death and things of this nature. So the next and probably most important witness of the entire case is Anthony Jackson, who is Isaac Jackson's son. He works for the Gitchells at the Gitchell store, and he basically lays out what happens. For the first time, we get a real sense that John O'Brien is unequivocally the aggressor. Now, earlier, as we talked about last week, there was definitely some hints that he was doing some things, that he was an aggrieved party, and so on and so forth. But now we really see, beyond any doubt, that John O'Brien is very physically aggressive and the aggressor in this entire situation. So as I mentioned, John O'Brien, in the testimony of Anthony Jackson, is physically violent toward Isaac Jackson. So he basically lays out a series of events wherein John O'Brien is not only verbally abusive to Isaac Jackson, he is also physically abusive to Isaac Jackson. He is beating Isaac Jackson, he's punching him now 2 or 3 times, he's kicking him, so on and so forth. That Anthony testifies that his father, is bruised about the face, that his beard is torn out. So yeah, this is something that we've never seen to this point. Now, it's worthwhile mentioning that Anthony Jackson did not testify before the coroner's inquest. So that's really important. I think that's something that's, definitely a key point there that we haven't heard from this guy before. So as we continue on, and it becomes ever more apparent that this testimony is definitely at odds with pretty much everything else, or at least maybe not at odds, but at least is kind of much more influential, I think, than anything else that we've that have been seen. So again, and he is testifying for the prosecution. He's called by the prosecution. When asked by the defense if he saw a weapon, now he does say that he didn't. That as far as he could see, John O'Brien was not armed at this point, and that he took basically his father away and washed him after this happened. So that does kind of account for where Isaac Jackson went. Pretty much in everybody's testimony, they're with John O'Brien. They don't really see what happens with Isaac Jackson. So Anthony Jackson says, yeah, I got him out of there. I got him out of there and kind of cleaned him up and sent him on his way. So on re-examination, on redirect, the prosecution basically begins to try to erode the testimony of Anthony Jackson. It's interesting. Maybe they figured that, to get it in front of it, that the prosecution would put Anthony Jackson on the stand initially, have him go through it, hear the cross-examination, then be able to redirect and kind of bring it down. Maybe that was their strategy. I'm not sure. But this is what they tried to do. They basically used a previous statement that he had made in the wake of the shooting itself. A private testimony, I guess, that he had made to a magistrate after the shooting that was not published. And they basically, so the Attorney General sets this against what he's saying in court now, and basically points out all the discrepancies, all the things that in the original statement, taken not long after the event, and is now, is very much at odds with the statements that he's making at trial, and the statement he's making at trial is very clearly much more damning to John O'Brien than was the statement that he made originally. So originally he's talking about one blow, now he's talking about three. He's his position in the crowd is different, so on and so forth. Anthony Jackson does defend himself against most of this. Some things he does admit that he didn't recollect, or he remembers differently now than what he did at the time. But for the most part, he does stick to the fact that he did see John O'Brien strike his father, and that's how it went. The Attorney General basically puts forward the theory: is it possible that the wounds that you're talking about were inflicted by Patrick O'Brien? Because Patrick O'Brien in his own testimony says, yes, I beat up Isaac Jackson after this happened. Anthony Jackson flatly refuses this. So again, I think it's very important testimony. He at this point in the trial, because again, it's somebody that we've never heard of to this point.